Okay, the numbers joining have slowed down, so I think I'll make a start as the last people trickle in. Well, yeah. So hi everybody. I'm Tamsin Blackster. I'm a researcher at Table, based at the University of Oxford, and I just wanted to say a few words about Table for anyone new to our work. So we examine different visions of the future of food. So through dialogue, through analysis, we try to describe and understand the futures that people in the food system want and why they want them. And we look at the changes that they think will be needed to reach those better futures. And this kind of work requires us and also the stakeholders we work with to recognise the importance of our own and other people's values and assumptions and beliefs, as well as the evidence that we all draw on. So we take the view that a good future isn't something that can be fully described, defined by a process of scientific deduction, because it is also a question of hopes, fears, values, and blind spots and assumptions. We are formally a, a collaboration between the University of Oxford, Wageningen University, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, la Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and perhaps soon more, but currently those five. Right, so that brings us to today's event, which is on the future of animals in the food system. So, the background of this event, there are many critical conversations taking place about animals in the food system, and these conversations take place in parallel. So, animal activists and vegan charities, welfare scientists and ethologists, animal ethicists, conservation scientists, practitioners of alternative systems of agriculture, all of these groups critique conventional animal agriculture, but each focus on different specifics and different strategies to achieve change. And we wanted to ask, to what extent are they trying to shape common or compatible futures? Where do people from these different perspectives agree on good outcomes and disagree on tactics? And where do they fundamentally disagree about what utopia might look like? So this event also marks the publication of Table's newest explainer, which is called Animal Ethics and Animal Welfare in Food Systems, and that's available to download from our website. But for today, we have 5 exciting panelists, and to introduce them and to shape this conversation further, I'm going to pass over to Jenny Splitter, Editor-in-Chief at Sentient Media, who's going to be our chair. So thanks very much, and over to you, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm Jenny Splitter, Editor-in-Chief of Sentient. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet covering the impacts of factory farming on a wide range of things: animals, climate, environment, workers, policy, health, and more. So let's get right into it. I'm going to ask my first question to each panelist, and we'll have everyone kind of briefly introduce yourself, and there'll be a full bio in the chat, and then kind of say the work that you do, and answer the question as a way to kind of kick things off. So let's start with Cleo. If so, you're going to introduce yourself, and then if give us an idea of what a different world with a better relationship between humans and animals would look like for you.
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. And it's great to be here. My name is Claire Verkel. I'm a researcher with the Stockholm Environment Institute based in Oxford. And I work on food systems transition and also animal welfare and sustainable development linkages. And last year, I was a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School focused on these issues as well. In terms of changes that would lead to better relationships between humans and animals, I think just doing much more to include animals in policy conversations would go a long way. It's something that in my international sustainable development governance, climate governance work, I see a real lack of. Animal welfare is mostly not considered in any of these venues. And I think that actually leads to outcomes that are bad for the environment, They're bad for human health because they increase the risk of things like zoonotic disease and antimicrobial resistance. They're bad for workers in the food system, and they're very bad for animals as well. So concretely, one example of what we're working on is exploring how the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as its follow-up, at some point we expect a post-2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, could actually start considering animal welfare, because it doesn't at the moment. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Nikki, can you go next?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Nikki Yoxall. I'm head of research at Pasture for Life, which is a UK-based not-for-profit organisation that promotes the restorative power of ruminant livestock. We also run a certification scheme for 100% pasture-fed livestock and their meat and dairy and also fibre products. And I also am a farmer, so I'm based in Aberdeenshire in North East Scotland, and run an agroecological grazier business with my husband, running a mob of cattle that we use in partnership with landowners to deliver soil health and biodiversity outcomes predominantly, but also producing 100% pasture-fed beef. And I think for me, something that's really important about kind of a better relationship with animals is time. I think as a farmer, one of the most important things I can do is spend time with my animals, observe, understand the relationships, the complexities of the relationships, understand their behaviors as much as possible. And one of the concerns I have, which actually links to what Cleo said, was about policy implications, often pushing farmers to do more all of the time, increasing pressures to undertake particular actions or outcomes, reducing the potential and opportunity for people just to stand in a field with their animals or in a pen with their animals or wherever their animals are and just spending time observing. And I think for me as a farmer, that really changes your relationship with the animals, and starts to help you understand their collaborative role with you as part of the team to deliver the outcomes that you're looking to achieve. So I think for me, that would be an important step.
Okay, Hiba.
Thanks, Jenny. It's great to be here. So my name is Hiba. I'm coming towards the end of a part-time PhD at the University of Oxford looking at the British halal meat industry. And for me, I think when imagining a better future for our relationship with animals, it's really around undoing the banalization of killing animals for food at scale. So words that come to mind when imagining a better future are mindful and sacred. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we've seen how highly industrialized societies that have the highest level of meat consumption also happen to have the highest levels of concealment of animal killing, both in terms of physical concealment and difficulty of access of spaces of animal killing, such as slaughterhouses, but also cognitive distance, lack of consumer knowledge about animal lives, subjectivities and behaviors, and the emotional detachment of both consumers and also those who are working in meat production. So it's not just about physical distancing here. So part of my work has been seeing whether there's any value in leveraging this term sacred or sacred outlook on killing animals. And this is not something that, this is a more expansive use of the term sacred and of the term ritual, teasing out this liminal space between the religious and the secular. So more secular imaginations of sacred discursive framings around animal killing. And I've teased a few strands of my work here, and I'm happy to speak more about this as the conversation progresses.
Can you just say, I just may have, I'm very intrigued by your work, so I may have missed it, but just what would a different world or better world be that more people sort of like break down that cognitive dissonance, would you say? Or did I just want to make sure I sort of have your framing?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what I should have mentioned also, so I think it would lead to and it would be accompanied by massive downscaling. But what I also should mention is that it's not a completely straightforward relationship, as I've seen in my work with halal consumers, where exposing people to animal killing, whether that be directly or more indirectly doesn't always it doesn't always lead to ethical transformation or reduction in meat consumption. It is a complex relationship. However, that being said, I think undoing that cognitive dissonance, increasing visibility, accompanied by downscaling, is what I would envision for a better future.
Okay, great. Thank you. Josh, let's go to you.
Thanks, it's nice to be here. So my name's Josh. I'm a lecturer in political philosophy at Loughborough University in the United Kingdom. My work concerns mostly animal ethics and food ethics. And in terms of a future relationship with animals, a future relationship with animals in our food system, I believe that we need to give animals rights. And I mean genuine rights, legal rights, rights that protect them from some of the things that some of us want to do to them. And that rules out a lot of the ways that we currently interact with them in the food system. Some people think that this means a completely vegan system. And I used to have sympathy with that kind of idea. I now think that there is some room for some middle ground in recognition, exactly the kind of thing that Tamsin was talking about a few minutes ago, of the wide range of values that we have in food and in our relationship with animals. But I do think that much of what we do is completely ruled out by that. And an important part of this, reflecting perhaps my disciplinary background as a political philosopher, and echoing something Cleo said, is representation of animals, ensuring that animals' voices, metaphorically, perhaps even literally, are heard in decision-making procedures, decision-making forums. And there's a range of institutional possibilities for what that might look like, from literal representation to representation via expertise to kinds of methods of listening to animals. And these are very much in their early stages of development. But I think this is the kind of direction that animal rights has to go if it's going to be anything more than just ruling out all relationships with animals.
Great, thank you. Harriet, last but definitely not least.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Harriet. I'm a research fellow at Oxford, and I work with farmers and testing and quantifying trade-offs among impacts of different farming systems, with a particular focus on climate impacts, biodiversity impacts, animal welfare, and antimicrobial use. And I also run some large-scale trials called the Hestia Farm Trials, aiming to help farmers improve their sustainability at scale. And I work mostly in the UK, Europe, Brazil, and Kenya. And so what would a better relationship with animals look like? So I would like to see, as Cleo and Josh have both touched on, that animals are actually included in policy decisions and they're factored into the decisions that we make. But I'd also like to see that is more evidence-based. And if I can speak sort of specifically about animal welfare, I think kind of two things really need to change. I think we need more and better evidence on the best ways of farming for animal welfare and other impacts. And we need that so we can understand and compare the overall welfare consequences of different approaches to farming. And this can't just be based on like one or two indicators. It really needs to be, as far as we can, using the best welfare science to represent the overall welfare consequences of different decisions. And so I led a study like this in the pig sector, where I went and assessed the broad welfare of lots of very different types of pig farms, from intensive all the way through to organic and woodland, and other impacts as well. But those kinds of studies are unfortunately rare, so it's quite difficult to make those really informed decisions. And then the second thing I think needs to happen is then taking existing and new evidence to really inform decision-making. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All of you have such, fascinating areas of work. I'm really excited to dig in. And so one of the sort of things we're going to talk about, which has long kind of plagued me, is this sort of idea of like pursuing, a utopian or ideal kind of goal versus compromise. And I confess, like, I am very much a pragmatist, even though luckily I don't really have to take a stance in my work as a journalist, but that's just like personally kind of how I lean. And so I'm wondering, for each of you, kind of what is an area of kind of compromise, and Josh kind of hinted at this already in a way, of like an area you see kind of that where you could compromise, and you also see that's like could be effective. Like maybe there could be some headway made between you know, kind of bridging gaps between different stakeholders. I don't know who to start with. I want to ask all, I am going to ask all of you, but well, Josh, since you did mention some of that, maybe you can go first.
Thanks. So one of the things that has been prevalent in animal ethics and animal activism for the last few years is, well, for the last few decades, in fact, has been this debate between the abolitionist animal rights theorists who say we want to remove all relationships with animals, right down to companion animals, right? Even that kind of relationship we've seen as inherently exploitative. And welfareists who might see a possible future with relationships with animals. And we can think about that disagreement both, to use the jargon of political philosophy, in ideal theory or non-ideal theory, or utopianism and pragmatism, roughly the same thing. Now, one of the things I've been trying to do in my work is to think very seriously about where animal rights might be able to move away from that abolitionism, not just in kind of pragmatic, non-ideal terms, but in ideal theoretic or utopian terms as well. And part of this comes down to the fact that I believe that in order to do good pragmatic or non-ideal theory, we need to have a sense of the direction in which we're going. And sometimes we have and that could be because, well, if we want to do non-ideal theory well, we're trying to move towards a just world. And if we don't know where we're going, it's very hard to start on that journey. And sometimes those disagreements can be quite stark. So the abolitionist world is one that some of us on this panel are just not going to get behind, right? But the kind of world that I've tried to defend, a kind of world in which animals' rights are respected. So yes, there's no killing of animals. Yes, there's no close confinement of animals. No, there's no infliction of gratuitous suffering on animals. But there might still be room for certain kinds of relationships with animals. There might still be room for the creation of certain kinds of animal products. So this is something we might talk about a bit more later, but I'm very excited about things like cultivated meat, or the forms of cellular agriculture. And this, I think, can be a way that we can recognize animal rights seriously by saying, well, we can't do these things to animals, while also recognizing the great value that many individuals place in access to these products. It's trying to take seriously the rights of animals while also take seriously the values that humans have. Similarly, people value working with animals. People value certain kinds of landscapes. These might not be things that are possible in an abolitionist world, but I think they might be things that are possible in an animal rights respecting world if we think more seriously about what kinds of rights animals actually have and the ways in which we can have mutually beneficial relationships with animals.
Okay, I'm definitely going to come back and push you on that, but I want to get to everybody. So Nikki, to go to like a completely different world. Yeah, like where are you maybe willing to, or are you, but you know, maybe there's some areas of compromise that you might be open to. What ideas do you have there?
Yeah, sure. And I just wrote down that line that Josh said, which was about an animal rights respecting world. And I think that's a really important future that I would love for us all to better understand how we can get to that. However, there will be subjectivity around what that looks like. And I think exactly as Josh said, you know, knowing where we're going and how we get there is going to be really key. And there are definitely, so speaking in my experience as a farmer, very different ways of thinking about how we manage our animals and how we support them to have the best possible welfare outcomes, and thinking about if we're going to map those using tools like the Good Life framework, rather, you know, which is about positive welfare outcomes rather than negative welfare outcomes. We don't want our animals to be free from suffering. We want them to have positive lives where they're able to express all of their innate behaviors and emotions and all of the things that we know animals experience. So I think reframing the way we think about understanding animals and their role in terms of how we think about welfare, just from a perspective point of view as farmers, is such an important thing to do. I absolutely, of course, I want my animals to be free from pain, but it goes, you know, you've got to sort of swing the dial in the other direction to think about positive opportunities for animals. I think it's a really tricky discussion because I can only represent what I do as a farmer. I can't represent all of farming, and within Pasture for Life, it is a very particular kind of alternative approach to farming. It's not the majority. It is, you know, kind of interesting in its alterity. But for us, an approach is thinking about how do we keep all of our family groups together for our animals. So we're not dairy farmers. We're, you know, the product, if you like, is biodiversity enhancement, soil carbon improvements, and beef. Those things are all come together as kind of outcomes for us. And keeping animals together in their families, in their family groups, maintaining those social interactions is really key. And for me, that's a very easy way to kind of support animals to have better welfare outcomes, is just, you know, well, I wouldn't want to be separated from my family. So maybe I want to keep, you know, allow these animals to stay together and give them choices and opportunities to engage with each other in different ways. We have a mix of polled, which means hornless, and horned cattle, and we don't take the horns off the ones that have horns. And you know, we're not castrating young males at birth. We leave them to grow, and then we do that kind of with local anesthetic, etc. So, and we'd love to get away from that if we could. So there are decisions that you can make as a farmer that are have greater system change requirements, but they're not impossible, right? These are things that you can do as a farmer. You can shift your system, you can do things differently. And actually, for some of us within the farming community, that gives us the opportunity to kind of create a market for people who are particularly interested in eating animal products or accessing animal products, but doing it in a way for them that aligns with a particular set of ethics or an ethos that they have. So I think it's not impossible. What's difficult is the often carbon lens that farmers are expected to view their systems from, and the trade-offs that leads us with. So if we want to reduce emissions intensity, we're often asked to intensify our systems, and that then leads to potentially challenging trade-offs. Not always, and as Harriet's excellent work has shown, particularly in the pig sector, that it's not about the system, it's the way the system's managed that has the greatest impact on animal health and welfare outcomes. So that's really key to remember. I think what we don't want to do in this argument is say these types of systems have the best welfare. Actually, what we tend to find is that it's about the management within the system. And often that is not how the public perception aligns with those systems. And I think that there's an education piece around that, but I'm sure Harriet can talk much more eloquently than I can about her own work.
Yeah, well, actually, I was going to go to Harriet next. I definitely want to hear your thoughts on kind of compromises, and I wonder if there's some way to tie it to evidence, because that is my kind of love language, and like how we come to some, maybe it's that, you know, like how do we come to some kind of agreement, and I don't even know who the we is in this because it's complicated, about you know, what is like strong evidence, like what kinds of what does evidence-based really mean, since a lot of people use that term. Yeah, like are there ways we can stay evidence-based and also kind of I don't know, have some kind of, you know, requirements, consistency about that. I don't know if that ties into compromise or not. Maybe I'm just shoehorning the conversation because I'm fascinated by evidence-based and everyone using it, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna start by asking the main question, hopefully get into evidence halfway through.
Perfect.
I'm drawn to pragmatism in the approach to what I think the food system should look like and what we should be doing now. I think the food system obviously has to change, and it needs to deliver on many fronts. There's a lot of challenges that we have there. And before I get into, I guess, the pig work and the pig of evidence, I thought it's worth mentioning that I think there's good evidence that there's a place for animals in an environmentally sustainable food system, and there's some that I think are pretty close to no-brainers, where they can be net positive. And examples would be, I mean, where I'm from, we have a big deer problem. So they're culled and they go to waste if people don't eat them, or we use them for other purposes. There's pretty solid evidence that bivalves can have a really net positive environmental impact. And I think also livestock can play a really key role in recycling food waste and the kind of livestock and leftovers approach. But coming back, I guess, to conventional farming and how evidence can be used. So the work that I did was essentially to go to more than 150 different pig farms in the UK and Brazil. and carry out assessments of their sustainability. And so they ranged from the most intensive pig farms in Brazil and the UK, so fully indoor systems that have sort of gestation crates, all the way through to organic and woodland farms, and looked at animal welfare, as well as carbon footprints, land use, and antimicrobial use to test if there were these kind of trade-offs. And I essentially found that there was substantially higher animal welfare in certain types of farm. So organic and free range were significantly higher than in the UK, those with no certification, Red Tractor and RSPCA assured. And like through doing that, I spent hours on all of these farms doing these welfare assessments, and using the best evidence-based welfare assessments that were available, which was a kind of adaptation of welfare quality for those that are familiar, which is, I would say, one of the has the strongest evidence-based of welfare assessments. It's largely animal-based, like outcome-based, rather than environment-based indicators. And through that, I have been to and seen farms that demonstrate incredibly high animal welfare. And so farms that have perfect scores, so no negative indicators and a bunch of positive indicators. And some of those farms also had incredibly low environmental impacts. So I think there is evidence, some of it I collected, but obviously a lot that I haven't collected from all kinds of other people, that farmed animals can have a life worth living. But I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the case, of course, on lots of farms at the moment. And the last thing I just wanted to mention, because I guess it hasn't come up yet, is context, I think, is really important here when we're talking about the future of farming systems. And I work in some places where livestock have huge non-food value, so cultural value. So, for example, cattle in Kenya and Brazil. And so partly that leads into why I think I have a pragmatic approach for figuring out the best ways of producing kind of any level of livestock product. Thank you. Hope that answers the question.
Yes. Okay, Cleo, just asking about this pragmatism versus utopian kind of, what areas for compromise do you think you see in your work?
Sure. I guess I resonate less with the idea of compromise and more with this idea that there are actually many different, very valid interests all happening at the same time in this conversation, right? So if we're talking about the food system, there's hundreds of millions of people, particularly in the global south, who are affected by food insecurity each year. And I saw a question coming up in the chats around that. That is obviously like a global priority that we should be sort of thinking about and seeking to address. At the same time, there are a lot of negative externalities associated with our current food system and industrial animal farming, including its contribution to climate change, biodiversity loss, air pollution, water pollution, diseases, the animal welfare impacts. And I think it's important to take all these various issues into account when we're talking about, okay, what kind of food system do we want to move towards to? Because if you are kind of prioritizing a system that is only focused on, say, maximizing food production, you will get a lot of negative externalities in other places. And we're sort of seeing that with the current food system. But if we were to only seek to maximize animal welfare, I think similarly, we would face a number of challenges, at least in the short term. And these range from, food security issues, but also many people who are dependent on the current food system just for their economic well-being, countries that are quite dependent on these sectors. And so maybe also drawing on my experience in international climate change governance, like that it is quite important that these types of big global societal transitions are a global conversation, because through these global conversations, we understand, okay, it's kind of challenging, obviously, for a country like Nigeria to just leave all its fossil fuels in the ground, for instance. If that type of action is necessary, or if that extraction of fossil fuels needs to be limited, the global community kind of needs to come together and then sort of explore ways that different countries at different levels of development can be supported, for instance, in transitioning to a more sustainable economy. And I think the same applies to our food system. So There are many synergies, I think, in terms of shifting away from industrial animal agriculture would probably be good for humans, environments, animals. But there might also be trade-offs, but we can manage those trade-offs if we talk about them. And a clear example of that, I think, is this sort of just transition conversation that is very present in the climate change conversation, recognizing that the workers, the communities, the consumers who are affected by climate policies need to kind of be supported towards a transition towards a more sustainable economy. And I think if we're looking to move to a food system that is more sustainable, better for humans and better for animals, we also need to be thinking about, okay, what interests are at play here, and what actions can be taken to sort of ensure everyone gets more positive outcomes. And I think that's good, having that conversation in a global way, and hearing people's different voices is important as part of that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hiba, just same question for you. And I wonder if maybe you could talk a little more about kind of, I think, there's long been a thread of like, oh, if people only knew what sort of a slaughterhouse looks like, they would stop eating meat. And like, clearly that sort of seems like it has not quite, it's not really true, but like people sometimes, learn about how meat is made and they're still eating meat for various reasons. But I'm wondering if you could talk about more of the complexity in your own work of like, just showing people, it's not enough to just sort of talk about how slaughter happens, but like sort of what else does resonate, or what else have you found?
Yeah, sure. So if it's okay, I'll get to that part in the second part of my answer, because there's something I want to specifically say about that.
Great.
About the complexity of this relationship between witnessing and ethical transformation. So an area of compromise that comes to mind in my work is within the halal slaughterhouse, within the British halal slaughterhouse, which actually isn't that different from non-halal slaughterhouses in the UK if they are stunning, pre-slaughter stunning. It's not actually that different, especially for sheep and chicken. I can talk about the nitty-gritty of the differences if anyone's interested, but my research ended up being quite critical of large-scale slaughterhouses and pointing towards, as I mentioned earlier, massive downscaling and dismantling of that system in order to move towards this goal of more mindful animal consumption. And I concluded that it was actually on several points, this critique was based on from several angles. So it was actually quite difficult to fulfill the halal ritual at scale when slaughtering at such a large scale. So if you only cared about that, about compliance, ritual compliance, religious permissibility, and you didn't actually care that much about animal welfare, ecological footprint, you could make an argument for downscaling because of the difficulty of even saying the entire ritual prayer and fulfilling all the parts of the ritual, maybe being able to fulfill the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. So the thesis itself was quite critical of those systems, but in terms of practically what's getting fed back to the industry, back to consumers, what I found more persuasive to people is talking about making small changes within the system. So there's this term tinkering that is used in science studies about making these small changes within a system to try and improve welfare. And they ended up being really, really small things like moving knife sharpeners or blood pumps, changing the decibel level of these pumps. And yeah, so I'm kind of experiencing that now as I'm coming towards the end of my PhD, having been immersed in the thesis writing part and trying to transition into dissemination, into thinking about research impact. it's kind of swung from more idealism to pragmatism in terms of what's being fed back. And maybe that's something that I should work more upon, trying to communicate larger scale changes. But that's just an observation about what I found is more persuasive, at least to this audience, this community. I just want to say something in answer to your comment, Jenny, about how this relationship between witnessing animal death, exposure, and ethical transformation is not so straightforward, and how it's not just this assumption of if only they knew what went on in slaughterhouses, then consumers would drastically change their behaviors. What I found interesting was it wasn't just a question of what's the level of exposure, but it was also who is curating these encounters, what kind of encounters are they with animal death, who's controlling them and who's deciding. And it's quite interesting because certain encounters acted, certain exposures to animal death acted to reassure and legitimize rather than to disturb and to question. And it really depended on what kind of animal systems people saw. And it seemed that there was quite a strong coalition between the halal meat industry and the British sheep farming industry, and lots of appetite to get religious scholars and those on halal certification bodies to go and visit sheep farms. But they did admit that if we were in the chicken industry, we might not be so keen on getting people to visit farms. And there was also a push for lamb consumption because of the fact that British Muslims consume lamb. Their level of lamb consumption is much higher than their national average, 60% weekly versus around 6% weekly for the national average of people who eat lamb weekly. So the types of encounters and who's curating them, who's allowing that exposure, and when they allow that exposure during certain times in certain places really affects that. So it's not just level of witnessing, it's type of witnessing as well. I think I've traveled away from the idealism, pragmatism question, but I just wanted to say that.
No, it's really interesting and helpful. And it kind of brings up something that this audience may already know, but kind of for a lot of readers, I think and I know myself before I started really covering ag, don't necessarily know how very different each like livestock animals are treated, have very different lives. Like a conventional farm beef cattle will live much longer than a chicken, and I mean on and on. But I think that's one of many important facets. I wanted to ask, I think, so it felt like a lot of this is, I think, both maybe Nikki and Josh, but maybe anyone can kind of jump in. But I came into this world of maybe you're covering a lot of like climate food intersections where there's a lot of talk about intensification and a lot of talk about sustainable intensification and what that would look like. And I'm, still kind of wondering, I was gonna say stickler, but I'm trying to keep my opinions out, wondering practically what your ideas are, thinking of compromise, or maybe you don't want to use that word or something, but about kind of meeting protein needs with a growing global population. And I'll just subnotes, there's so many complicated layers here, so sorry for interrupting myself, but one thing is that a lot of climate researchers recommend, that the global north essentially be doing the meat reduction, just to say that. So it does obviously depend on the context, but Josh, you mentioned all proteins, which I find fascinating, have covered that industry, but the scale, some of those products, the scale is looking, the timelines are not looking maybe as good as they did in the beginning when a lot of those companies first launched. And Nikki, you had mentioned some before we got started the recording about sort of dairy farmers not weaning, which is that kind of animal welfare move is so fascinating to me, but my immediate pragmatic doomsday response is like, oh, that would be so expensive. And I know there's a farmer in the US I talked to who like tried to do that and couldn't, and it was too expensive. So all this long-winded way is saying like, how do we sort of grapple with the growing protein need, which I know does not need to be animals, but like, that sort of like struggle, and wanting to, think about this like better system, whichever better system that looks like for either of you, which would look differently, but like, how do you balance those two things? Sorry for being so long-winded. Nikki, do you want to go first and then Josh?
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think how I can answer concisely. I mean, I guess one of the things is that, and I've made reference to it in answering a couple of the questions in the typed response in the Q&A, for me is this, the research on sort of, for example, grazing management and pasture management and land use is about 7 to 10 years behind where the most progressive farmers are, right? So let's just talk about land modeling and the assumptions that are made about, extensive grazing takes up way more land than intensified systems, or that so therefore we must eat less meat. One of the things that one of the problems that I'm kind of coming across when I work with lots of researchers on various modeling programs across Europe is that their assumption is that you have pasture and you have arable and never the twain shall meet. So there's no comprehension almost that livestock like sheep or cattle could be used within an arable setting as an integrated, not mixed farm, but an integrated system dynamic. And there's completely no comprehension, often it seems, of things like adaptive multi-paddock grazing, where we have now got research both from the US and the UK that shows that can double the carrying capacity of the grassland. So the assumption that grass-fed, for example, or more extensive systems require us to have fewer animals just isn't being borne out in reality. So all of that assumption is coming from modeling data that is based in sort of 90s figures around how many animals you have per hectare, for example, or the potential for the amount of grass or forage that can be grown. Very little of this is actually being measured, and farm researchers are not going out onto farms and actually going, okay, what's your stocking rate here? How are you doing that? So there's a massive disconnect between
wait, you're talking about stocking density being looked at versus like actual carbon in the soils, which that is being studied, right?
No, what I'm saying is that there's an assumption that if you want to have pasture-fed meat, you have to have fewer animals, right? And what I'm saying is that the research that is being done is only just starting to explore this, where we have farmers, particularly, my work all focuses on the UK, where we've got research coming out of Rothamsted Research Institute who is saying, actually, if we start changing the way we manage this grazing system, we can have more animals here, which means that we're not having to put animals into sheds, for example. We're not having to put them into more feedlot systems. We can actually maintain them at pasture. But this is kind of current practice for many farmers, not all, but many farmers who are thinking more about their grassland management, thinking about these rotations, that is enabling them to carry more animals. So a lot of the assumptions that are then finding their way into policy about land use, assumptions about how many animals we can sustainably manage, for example, are just not being borne out in reality, because what's actually happening in reality is quite different from what these models are suggesting. So that's one challenge. The other issue, which you just mentioned then, Jenny, is about soil carbon, right? And the science on this has so far to go. Like, it's all of the soil scientists are just like, we just really, this is hard. We're not able to monitor it enough. The changes, it's hard won, easily lost soil carbon. We don't really know, because it takes years to really research this stuff. And as you start researching something and then methodologies change or protocols change. So we're kind of making assumptions and making decisions and basing policy on science that is kind of happening as we're doing it, and we're trying to work out how we deliver this. So these trade-offs, these challenges, the issues around that, which then all have implications for the policy levers we've all mentioned that are pushing for sustainable intensification. In my personal view, is an oxymoron. I don't think it can exist. The policy is driving these things, whereas actually there are alternative practices, alternative approaches that could be studied more holistically, which is where this holistic assessment of sustainability is so vital. Things like the Global Farm Metric, public goods tool, other tools that are being used to do that. that are based in ground truth data rather than only relying on models to determine the future scenario, for example.
Okay, well, I hate to get us on a whole soil carbon discussion. That is kind of my, but I will say I have a different view than you, but we'll just leave it at that. But Josh, I would love to kind of push you on some of the more, how we, the practicalities of kind of feeding more people, getting, I don't even want to say protein because we are a little overly obsessed with protein in the US, but let's just say, we've got a growing population. If something like cultivated meat, which seems very cool to me, just doesn't scale up at all, we don't get a clean grid, so the emissions are high, all these things, like what are more like, there's perhaps not enough bivalves, which I'd be all for, like maybe to feed everybody. Like what kind of wiggle room are you kind of seeing opportunities around?
Great, thanks. That's a big question. I will just note, and I don't want to snipe, but I think it's striking that Nikki compared the intensive animal agriculture to her preferred form of animal agriculture, didn't mention plant protein. I mean, if we want to talk about land use, growing beans is more effective, right? That wins, right? Now, sure, some people don't like the taste of beans, whatever, okay? You might say that that's a comparatively minor concern. In terms of the specific question, you're absolutely right that cultivated meat and other forms of cellular agriculture are perhaps not as developing as quick as some of their more optimistic proponents championed. So the joke that we tell is, it's been 5 years away for 20 years. Well, it's been 3 years away for 10 years. Let's put it like that.
Yeah.
Part of the problem here is the fact that we're just not seeing this central investment, right? And so you get this strange circular argument that people are opposed to cultivated meat and other forms of cellular agriculture because it's relying on private venture capital funding. And that's because governments are not really funding this in any serious way. There's been an announcement out of the Netherlands, they're giving a bit of money. They've led the way there. A few smaller countries, Singapore, Qatar, obviously, countries with particular food security challenges very interested in this because they are not countries with large amounts of farmland. So yes, I'm not going to say that this is the silver bullet that will save everything. I don't make predictions. That's not the kind of game I'm in. However, I think we're not giving it a fair chance when we compare the amount of money that we give out to animal farmers, right, through subsidies. North America, of course, the right wing is, they hate giving out money to people, except when it comes to animal farming. And suddenly there's a blank check, right? Same kind of things going on in Europe, though perhaps not to the same extent. If we saw even a fraction of that money going towards this kind of research, we could see major developments. Would that save the world? I don't know. I agree with you about bivalves. I think that's an exciting thing, and I'm glad that it wasn't me who raised this, because this is one of the things I always end up talking about. Why are bivalves different? And I think it's worth stressing that. Why are bivalves different from my perspective? So Harriet's already pointed out quite rightly that bivalves have really serious environmental benefits, right? They clean the oceans in various ways. They don't require land. They don't require water, etc., etc., etc. Why are they better from my perspective? Well, all of that, and also these are animals who, the argument could be made, are not sentient. They're not thinking, feeling beings. They don't have a welfare to consider, okay? On my view of animal rights, in order to have rights, one needs to be sentient. So the deer that Harriet mentioned, they're sentient. We shouldn't be killing them, in my view. You could talk about the environmental benefits, etc. I think we should be trying to find new ways not to kill these animals rather than new ways to do something with them once we've killed them. When it comes to bivalves, we're very much on the same page. And again, I echo what's been said about not loving the talk of compromise, but this is one of the areas where there might be serious overlap from this kind of, from an animal rights perspective, an animal welfare perspective, a food security perspective, etc. And I just want to finish on that food security note, because a number of people have said in the chat things to the effect of, can we seriously talk about animal rights in a world where there's serious food security problems? I would put it the other way. We can't afford not to talk about what we're doing to animals in a world where there's serious food security problems, because so many of these food security problems are attributable directly or indirectly to our reliance on animal agriculture through this extensive land use, through the horrendous carbon emissions, through the health impacts of these kinds of things that are affecting those who are most food insecure the worst. They are the people who have less money. They are the people who have less voice in national and international politics. They are the people who are most negatively impacted by the externalities of animal agriculture, even if right now, sadly, they are relying in a large way on animal agriculture for their food.
Okay, thank you. I know Nikki and Josh are like very far apart, but I want to bring everyone in the conversation. Cleo, I know you have your hand up, but also you mentioned just transition in your previous comments, right? I wondered if you could say like what how you see animals, like what do they have a voice in a just transition? That would be my one of my questions, and then and also make your point that you wanted to make.
Sure, thanks. So maybe I can just sort of answer the previous question and sort of end on the just transition part.
Yeah.
But I very much agree with many of the things Josh was highlighting. I think Jenny, you're absolutely right to highlight there's challenges involved with, you know, the alt protein shift or shifting towards more plant-based diets. But I really do think we need to be asking what the alternative would be, and the alternative that we currently have is just incredibly unsustainable. It's bad for the planet, it's bad for the people. And when you're talking about the health risks, like serious pandemic risks that might come from how we're currently farming animals, I don't think we really have an alternative in the medium term to shift towards a more sustainable and healthier food system. And we recently published a paper where we looked at a variety of interventions that are currently being put forward and adopted to sort of mitigate emissions from the farmed animal sector. And we categorize these in different buckets. So sustainable intensifications coming up a lot, species shifts, for instance, shifting from beef to chicken, and then more sort of holistic transitions, so systemic transitions such as towards alt protein and more whole plant-based diets. And we find that there really are significant risks, not just for animal welfare, but generally for one health, for many of these interventions that are currently being put forward and promoted, in fact, by especially, or including at the UN level, where the UN Food and Agriculture Organization is really pushing the sustainable intensification framework, that ultimately, you know, is just going to create more risks for sustainable development. And for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic has been one of the biggest setbacks you can imagine for progress in sustainable development. And yet with the food system, we're sort of creating similar risks at the moment. So I don't think there's an alternative to shifting towards these other food systems. And I totally agree with Josh that this is a political will question in the end. And, you know, we've seen huge leaps in terms of renewable energy, and that's partially because of huge investments that has come from governments over the past years. And at the moment, governments are subsidizing industrial animal agriculture, and much less is going into more sustainable food systems. So there's all a choice there. And then just transition is a key part to all of this. I think it's really been important. So the idea of just transition sort of developed in the 1970s in the US, sort of a response to the fact that environmental regulations could have social implications. And it's really gotten a lot of traction in the energy sort of conversation, recognizing that, you know, jobs will change, probably need to wind down. Whole communities will be affected by a shift towards a more sustainable energy system. And we need to, I think also, it's starting to happen, but more slowly, pivot the just transition conversation as well to the food system. And there's two reasons for it. It's like, it's both an ethical issue that stakeholders are going to be affected, and we can't just leave whole communities behind. We need to think very seriously about how people will be affected, especially because these are people that are sort of, you know, their contribution to society, they're sort of feeding our societies at the moment. We can't just sort of forget about them and move on. We need to sort of bring them along and create and co-develop a future for them that makes sense and that they can buy into. That's important in and of itself, but it's also just important very pragmatically from a political will perspective. if you're going to leave lots of stakeholders behind, they are not going to buy in to the new system that you want to create. And I think there are some examples happening of, industrial life, animal ag facilities actually shifting to, say, mushroom farming. And governments, again, have a significant role to play here. The government of the Netherlands is actually investing billions in sort of buying up industrial animal farms and sort of trying to wind down that system to some extent in the country, given all its environmental impacts. But arguably, a lot of that has come too late, and a lot of the stakeholders were sort of taken by surprise that they were having to shift. And so it also needs to be planned out and inclusive. But there are lots of lessons we can learn from the energy conversation there, which is a bit more advanced.
Okay, but just want to note for people messaging me that I see your questions and we're going to turn to them in 1 second. I wanted to go to Harriet next though. And I also wonder if you could say a bit about like, what is, better welfare for pigs look like, maybe a bit on the gestation crates, which we've been doing a lot of writing about with Prop 12 in the United States.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to touch, if I can, briefly first on the sustainable intensification and trade-off.
Yes, please do.
So I think sustainable intensification has to include welfare. A system isn't sustainable if it doesn't. And I think, maybe it's a matter of definitions, but I would say sustainable intensification is producing more from less. So I would say, Nikki, maybe what you're doing is sustainable intensification, but maybe you define it differently. But yeah, I just want to challenge, I guess, that there's these inevitable trade-offs between intensification and things like animal welfare. And I don't tend to use the word intensification because I think it's quite poorly defined and people mean different things. So if, for the sake of this conversation, we say an intensive farm is an indoor farm, then I'll go back to pigs and say overall, I did find that there was this trade-off where the more intensive farms, the indoor farms, had lower carbon footprints, lower land use footprints, but they had poorer animal welfare and higher antimicrobial use. But extensive farms, so organic free range, were the opposite. They had higher environmental impacts, but better animal welfare and lower antimicrobial use. But that trade-off wasn't inevitable. There were several farms that were good for all four things, including indoor ones, including the intensive farms, ones that had really low environmental impacts and a really high animal welfare. So just like to challenge the idea that there's this inevitable trade-off there. And also, if I can touch on the emerging infectious disease risk. So we had a project that I can share in the chat, critically evaluating these claims that it's intensive livestock farming driving the risk of pandemics. And there are definitely risks associated with indoor farming and pandemic risk, but there are also huge risks associated with outdoor and extensive farming and emerging infectious disease risks. So I'll drop that in the chat if you're interested more on that. And what does better welfare mean for pigs? So I guess this comes a bit back to this like broad evidence base that I mentioned earlier, and that people tend to focus on these kind of heuristics because they intuitively make sense and they're much simpler to understand. Like, is the animal indoors or outdoors? Does it have cut tails or not? Those kinds of things. And whilst those things are important animal welfare indicators, they're not the only important animal welfare indicators. And the only really, I think, to assess the overall welfare of potentially an indoor system that uses something like gestation crates and an outdoor system that doesn't, is to assess the things that would be positive and negative welfare outcomes in both of those. You then come into these inevitable challenges of like how you weight, bursitis swelling on pigs' legs that you get in indoor systems, and thermoregulation temperature problems that you inevitably get in free range systems, how you equate those things, but only by being fair in the assessments you do. And I think there's a bit of danger that at the moment, quite a lot of welfare assessments focus on the issues of indoor systems. And so then when you apply them to outdoor systems, they're not capturing the welfare issues that are in free range systems. Thank you.
Okay. I have a lot of questions about that, but I want to get all the questions in the chat. This is impossible for me. And before I get to that, does everyone on this panel agree that folks in the global north do need to reduce their meat consumption and eat more plants? Like, are we all agreed on that? Or could we all sign on to that or no? Yes, Nikki.
I think we need to be careful that just saying that meat is meat is meat, right? So for me, I think that there's a real difference, for example, between poultry and ruminant livestock and pigs, and thinking about how many chickens are killed every day for people to just eat a part of the chicken. So I think it's a really difficult thing to say, yes, I totally agree that we should, in the global north, eat less meat, because we're assuming that all meat is equal. And I think that's a really difficult thing
But
to
are
do.
we assuming that? Like, couldn't we
Well,
say
I mean, unless you
a
say
model in which we eat
quantify
a
it.
lot less meat, and then that meat is like beef, who maybe get a great outdoor life, say.
Yeah, I just think that
Without
just
birth.
making blanket assumptions that we need to
Sure.
eat less meat is, well, maybe we could eat less of some types of meat, the same of some meats. I think it depends. People in the global north, for some, really need to eat high iron diets, particularly if we think about young women. So I just think that it's far more complex than that sentence is encapsulating.
Okay, but I feel like you gave me some wiggle room. Like, maybe we could eat some less meat and still get some iron and eat lots of plants, lots of great plants that farmers are growing. Could we?
Yeah, loads of kale, loads of spinach, lots of very iron-rich plants. But, you know, people could eat less of one meat and more of the meat that they could buy from me directly, for example, cutting out the middleman and adding, you know, I'll put my website in the chat. But, you know, I think that's, you know, there's potentially a scope for maneuver there.
Well, Josh, if you're going to answer, go ahead, but then I'm going to push you in the same direction, in a different direction, but go ahead real quick.
Good. Well, I think, again, not wanting to snipe, but Nikki, I think your cards are revealed when you say, oh, and then when you can buy your meat from me, right? I mean, there's perhaps a conflict of interest here, might be one way of putting it. I would say, so to answer the question that you asked, Jenny, do I think we need to be eating less meat? Well, it depends what you mean by meat. I actually agree with Nikki there. If we were talking about, for example, plant-based meat, eat as much as you like. It's not very healthy, most of it, but eat as much as you like. If we're talking about cultivated meat and we imagine in 20 years, yeah, again, assuming we're creating it in an animal-friendly way, in an environmentally friendly way, which most models suggest we would be, yeah, eat as much as you like. Might not be that healthy, whatever.
Well, wait, I have to push back. So what if we get some verification, some outside verification that gets us to say like, hey, this is like the highest welfare you could get for beef. And you're not, and you have a population of people, which we have, who are like, I will not ever be just eating plant-based meat. I am eating meat. Would you be happier with that? Would you, like, as long as we could get these welfare agreements, you know, these we have an objective, say someone who comes in and verifies like, this is the highest welfare you could possibly get, and you're going to reduce, but you get a pledge to reduce. Is that something you could see as a better outcome than the overconsumption we have right now?
I mean, sure, relatively speaking. There was a wonderful comment in the chat earlier. I think it was Clara, maybe, I can't remember my own handwriting. How do we take the animal's desire to live seriously in conversations about welfare, right? If these animals want to go on living, or if these animals could continue having a good life, I'll not go into the, you know, the ethics of the badness of death. You know, I'm not going to give you a philosophy lecture. If we're taking this point seriously, how can we ever kill them in a way that is consistent with welfare? Sure, maybe we can kill them in ways that involve less suffering, just as you could kill me in ways that involve more or less suffering. That doesn't mean it's all right to kill me. That doesn't mean that, you know, everything's hunky-dory, right? And I think that there's a lot of good work, even outside of an animal rights perspective, about trying to understand death, killing, from a welfare perspective. And I know that Nikki's sympathetic to these ideas of positive welfare. I respect that. I think that's a wonderful thing. If we're serious about positive welfare, we need to recognize that when we cut an animal's life short, and this has already been mentioned, maybe some people in the audience don't know this, when we're killing animals, even on high welfare farms, they are killed at a tiny fraction of their life for the most part, right? A tiny fraction of their natural lifespan, so much as the idea makes sense when we're talking about animals that are very different from those that live in the wild. And that means the loss of a lot of life that they would have had. That seems to be a welfare problem, or we could think about that as a welfare problem. Someone in the chat, I think it was Keys, again, I can't read my own handwriting, sorry, Kees, I think, said, well, why do we have to kill these animals at all, right? I'd like to put that question to Nikki, because I respect a lot of what you're talking about. There was a great question as well in the chat about what's the earliest memory of an animal. I grew up in the countryside. You know, before I was walking and talking. I was listening to birds, I was interacting with animals. I'm not the urban vegan stereotype, right? However, I can respect the fact that you want to live in a certain environment, you want the countryside to look in a certain way. I'm talking generally now, but also to Nikki. You want to work with these animals, you want to have access to certain kinds of foods, etc. Why do you have to kill the animals? If what's important is living with these animals, interacting with these animals in certain kinds of way, having access to certain kind of products that we can create without the killing, why do we still need the killing in there? If we're serious about positive welfare, surely the natural conclusion is that we stop killing.
And I just want to say that's also a question in the Q&A. So I'm gonna say we're gonna, for each of the panelists, I feel like I know where you stand, Josh, but could you imagine a world in which we have some relationship with animals that isn't inherently exploitative, does not depend on their slaughter? So Nikki, could you go first?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really conscious that Cleo and Hiba maybe are having less opportunity
Yes, I know,
to
and I'm going to
speak
go to you
than
both.
Josh and I. So I'll
Yes,
try and be
yes.
quick. But yeah, you're right. There is an argument for that. And interesting, okay, I'm going to give you a very sort of personal experience that we're going through at the moment. We have two older cows who will be going to the slaughterhouse on Friday. It's really difficult. One of them was one of the first heifers we ever bought. All of our animals are named. So that's Betty. She's a lovely animal. She's very independent. She doesn't like a fuss. She's not really that interested in kind of having connection with us, other than recognizing that if she follows us, she gets to get new grass. And she's actually the lead cow, has been the lead cow in our herd for about 4 years now. She's a really great girl, if you like, but this year she rejected her calf. She tried to kill her calf this year, so we had to raise the calf separately. She then got a really bad case of mastitis, has been really, really ill. She was, pretty much at death's door. We had to spend a lot of time really helping her through her recuperation and really, really trying to help her get better. And we've had a very difficult conversation about what happens to Betty, because actually within our herd, she has tremendous value in terms of being the lead cow, creating a social structure that the other animals look up to her, they follow her. But at the same time, she can no longer, we can't trust her to have calves in the future because of the way she behaved with her calf. She's had health problems that are highly likely to happen again as a result of that, which was awful for her. And so we are having to make a decision that we are going to cull her and that she will enter the food chain. And that's a horrible, horrible, difficult thing to do. And the process of us taking her to the abattoir, it's important for us that we take her. We don't ask someone else to do that. We do that ourselves. We take her along. And we have to go through that process. And it is not an easy thing for us to do. It's really, really difficult. So inevitably, there will be times when an animal has to be culled. And I think Bill has made reference to this in the chat, that there are times where we do have to cull animals out of the system because they are just for their own, either that or they're going to be very ill for a long period of time. That's not fun for an animal, putting it through the risk of poor health and poor future welfare. So there are times when we have to do that. And for us, we try and make it so that animals go to slaughter at a point where it makes the most kind of sense, I guess, for us. And for some people, I know that is anathema. They just won't understand what I'm saying and won't agree with it. But I'm trying to just explain our perspective. We do also have animals that we slaughter at a younger age because of the over 30-month rule, which you can look into in more detail. I won't explain it now. I've made reference to it in the chat. And so for those animals, if we take them older, there's actually quite a risk that they might not even enter the food chain because the particular abattoir, because we have so few abattoirs now, if they have any concerns about that animal, they're not able to test for BSE, which is what the over 30-month rule relates to. So there's all these sort of things. So we are often making decisions about culling animals younger than we might want to. But to come back to the question about why do we even have to kill them at all, there are people for whom eating meat is an important part of their diet. It's an important cultural touch point for them. And there are people who are going to continue to eat meat. I always think, I'm always amazed at how little meat we eat, actually, given that we produce beef as a product. We actually don't eat a huge amount during the week. And I probably forget how much more meat people eat because we don't eat chicken and we don't really eat pork. So for us, the only meat we eat is that we raise ourselves. And so actually for us, it forms a really important part of our diet. It's a really important source of iron and a whole pile of other omega-3. For example, I won't eat salmon. So for me, it's a really important source of omega-3 fatty acids. So there's lots of dietary reasons why that product is really important. It connects us to place. it's of the land. For us, there's an element of ritualistic kind of I guess gratitude for what those animals have done, and that animal, rather than just going off into some nameless kind of point where it's killed, actually being able to share that with neighbors, friends and customers and people that want to then pay for that, makes sense for us. And I totally get that lots of people in this audience won't understand that and will find it very difficult to hear, just as I cannot imagine eating fake meat, as it were. I don't even like eating something that is like a nameless plant protein. At least tell me what the plant was that made it, right? Like the kind of ultra processed food, I find it really difficult to engage my understanding with. So I think in
that's
some
a
ways,
whole other topic,
yeah,
whole other
totally,
debate on ultra
yeah.
processed food. But thank you so much. I'm trying to get us to everyone. But Hiba, I'm curious your answer about, like, you know, maybe in your research, if like looking at it, you know, kind of alternatives to the future that might include not slaughtering animals, maybe in the communities you've looked at. I know there are a few Muslim organizations that are either vegan or looking at like reduction. And so, yeah, I'm wondering if any of that has come up in your research, or any thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the context of the community that I've been researching, there's absolutely a community, the British Muslim community, having higher meat consumption than the national average. So we've been talking about meat consumption for the average British consumer. This is even higher, both in the statistics of industry reports, but also just anecdotally in the interviews and the survey research that I've been doing. There seems to be this amplified cultural value of meat. I mean, we've already talked about cultural value of meat, but it seems to be even more of an emphasis in this community. So there's absolutely a huge push to decrease meat consumption. In terms of vegan and vegetarian movements within that community, again, lower than the national average in terms of percentage of vegans. In my sample, it was a sample of 700 consumers, about 4% identified as vegetarian or vegan. And I would say that that's probably an over representation, just in terms of the kinds of people who responded to my survey and were interested in engaging with research about animal killing. Maybe there's a bit of selection bias there, people who have more sympathetic to these kinds of conversations. But I think there's a lot of work to do on emphasizing the cultural value of plant-based protein, but more grassroots, more of a grassroots approach. So rather than thinking about, because it's already quite a, you could say it's already quite radical to try and shift the conversation to decreasing meat, but also to bringing in completely new types of protein. It's more about rediscovering or looking for plant-based protein in traditional foods. And especially for British Muslims in the UK, there's about 60% of them are South Asian, and there's a huge, rich variety of traditional plant-based protein in South Asian cuisine that we can really try and celebrate and promote, rather than that's just personally what I've seen is more effective, trying to look within the community to what's already seen as traditional and accepted. Just to apologies to answer another question, but it came up in the chat, and you mentioned it, Jenny, around first experiences of animals. What was interesting is what emerged as a theme of my survey was childhood exposure to animal killing. So when asked, when have you seen slaughter, have you seen it at all, quite a few respondents said that they had these vivid, visceral memories of being a child and seeing slaughter for the first time. And it almost seemed as if there was this effort to expose children to slaughter, at least in this community, which maybe is different from, I don't know, I suppose it depends on urban versus rural identities. But that seemed interesting, that childhood emerged as a key stage for socialization, but for inculcating what was seen as acceptable human-animal relations, whether that was killing or concealment of killing. But that childhood was a really key stage for this. But yeah, that just came to mind when I saw that question.
Great. I think just to get a couple more questions in, maybe for Harriet and Cleo, I'm gonna maybe ask you, and you can feel free to comment on previous ones, but just in case. Veronica asks, curious what role the panelists think that images, various forms of media have in shaping visions for our future relationship with animal. Who has the power to shape these images and whose voices should we be valuing? I also saw a question about wild animals, which I'm very interested in. So if that sparks anything, go for it. Yes, Harriet.
That was what I wanted to bring up. So I
Fabulous.
think no future of a food system that's feeding everyone doesn't have killing in it. If everyone is vegan, we are still farming arable crops that require pest management and other things, right? And those are sometimes very far from humane. And so while it would be much less killing, particularly because we would need less arable farming and crop farming if you're in a vegan world, there's no future that doesn't involve some animal killing in the food system. We wanted to highlight that and just touch on, I guess, coming back a bit to like the cultural value and just like as an example, we do a little bit of work with the Maasai community. And I mean, for 5 centuries, they've had their cultural traditions in how they kill cattle. And I mean, I don't know if anyone's arguing that we need to stop that, but yeah, there's important cultural considerations there as well.
Yeah, go, great, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can come in on the wild animal welfare question as well. So there is a link here to climate policy too. Like I was saying, I think there's currently a risk, a real risk. It's already happening where climate change policy is negatively affecting animal welfare in the farmed animal sector because of one of the examples I gave was the beef to chicken shift. Way more animals are implicated. They tend to have much worse lives, the intensification. I take Harriet's point that in some cases, some systems, you know, you have to look at the nuance of the system. But in sort of overarching ways, I think there is a big risk of animals kind of being the sacrificial lambs of climate action. And that also extends to wild animals to some extent as well, at least you know, new infrastructure that is being built will affect wild animals, everything from adaptation infrastructure to renewable energy. And the point is not that we should not be doing these things because they are essential for the energy transition, but the point is we should be taking animals into consideration. So both farmed animals, but also wild animals as we are adopting these types of policies because so many of them implicate animals. And just to go beyond climate policy towards more sustainable development governance, biodiversity governance. Sometimes people sort of assume like, oh, we're sort of conserving animal species, so that's good for animal welfare, and you know, it's all part of the same thing. But that really isn't the case at all necessarily. You could poison an entire species that is non-native, for instance, to conserve another species. You can hunt animals in quite painful ways. Even breeding in captivity to support biodiversity goals might be negative for individual animals' welfare. So it's really important to make that distinction. So I think, you know, even within the sort of policies we're currently making in the sustainable development realm, a lot of them are relevant to animal welfare. And should be taking animal welfare seriously. I think the question maybe was quite open-ended. Where does that responsibility end, right? And I know there's a whole philosophical debate around this. You know, should we intervene in a lion sort of hunting an impala, etc. I don't really want to go there. I think that it's an interesting philosophical question to be discussing, but I think there are so many very concrete ways in which our actions are currently affecting animal welfare that it would be helpful to focus on those right now, because there's something we can do about them, and then sort of maybe save some of the other questions for later or for the philosophy departments, and take it from there.
One question I'm seeing here that brings up something we haven't really gotten into is, you know, whether we apply the same standards to fish and insects. Companion animals are also mentioned, but I do kind of want to touch on that because it's been interesting for me to learn kind of about fish sentience as more research has come out. I guess maybe a question might be just like, as more, you know, as in looking to sort of feed, you know, the whole population, growing population, we looked at these different, like, oh, could we scale up insect farming, you know, do more aquaculture? And then obviously there are both animal welfare considerations and also like zoonotic disease risk, antibiotics and all this stuff. Is there any possibility we'll be able to sort of avoid the problems we've had with intensifying CAFOs with, like, is there something we can like put in place now, you know, maybe policy wise conversations to start addressing these things? Josh, go ahead, and anyone can raise your hand if you want to jump in.
Thanks. So I'm not a fan of fish farming. Fish are pretty clearly sentient in my view. However, the insect question is a very interesting one. The first thing to say is that insect farming is very much already here in a very big way, right? Yeah. We're not eating many insects in Britain, where I am, you know, very occasionally, but very minor amounts. Actually, most insect farming is going into feeding other animals that we farm. So they're entering the food system in that way. But also insects have been eaten for a long, long time around the world by humans. The interesting question for me is, are insects sentient? And I mean, that is a very difficult question, a philosophical question, but also a question that relies upon a lot of difficult scientific data. Right now, we're just not quite sure, and we can draw the lines in different ways. So what a lot of people advocate is taking something like a precautionary principle, right? We should put into place measures to limit welfare impacts, and that might mean developing a science of insect welfare, which is a very underdeveloped area. Or if you take my kind of view, if you take a kind of animal rights view, it might mean just ruling that out right here, right now. I think insect farming is potentially big risk, big reward situation, ethically speaking. It has a great potential, but at the same time, if these animals are sentient, we are talking about untold quadrillions of individuals who might live lives of suffering.
Anyone have any other thoughts on sort of like insect farming or fish? Yes, Cleo.
Yeah, I agree with Josh on the fish farming and the animal welfare considerations there, as well as potential health risks like antimicrobial resistance is an issue in that sector, biodiversity loss as well. When insect farming, yeah, I think the animal welfare aspect is interesting, and I think Josh summarized sort of the state of the science well, and the fact that, you know, there are risks involved in terms of us not really understanding the experiences of insects, and also, you know, what circumstances lead them to suffer or lead good lives. So I think that is a relevant consideration. From this sustainability sort of perspective, I think there are actually also very interesting questions that are often brushed over. So Josh kind of mentioned already that a lot of insect farming actually goes into industrial animal agriculture as a source for fish, chickens, pigs, and so might actually be sort of just an input into this existing system, maybe lock it in further because it makes it harder to shift away rather than forming some kind of alternative to that system. So I think that is important to think about. Also, I think it depends a lot on the country, but what are insects replacing in the human diet? In the global north, we see a lot like insects like pasta or cookies, etc. But that is actually not it's not replacing then conventional meat products. So I think that's really important to think about as well. And from sort of theoretically, insects are very efficient in terms of the way they grow. They don't have bones, and they can they can be grown on food waste, right? So in some ways that is a very efficient system. I think what we're seeing in practice, at least at the moment, is that it's very hard to scale up insect farming in a way that food waste is used as an input, because it's just a bit more unreliable. It's a bit more risky than just using regular soy and grain. So I do think it is important to sort of have some questions around the insect farming, whether it is in fact worth investing, the billions that will be necessary to scale this up, or whether those billions could be going somewhere else, into a system that is actually possibly more sustainable, and better for animal welfare, because we are making choices here in terms of where we direct resources. And I'm not convinced that insect farming is actually has the benefits that are often ascribed to it.
Harriet, there are actually a lot of questions about pig welfare, and I'm noticing as I scrolled all the way to the bottom, and I kind of have those too, just because I'm very interested in like, I just, what have you, maybe you can get into a few more details in terms of like indoor and gestation crates, like, in California, there was like that Prop 12 gave a little bit more space, not a lot. Are there sort of welfare efforts that address what seems to me to be, I understand that the concern is like that the mother pig might actually squash the baby pigs. But are there like sort of concrete steps that are being taken, or the indoor farmers that you've seen better welfare conditions for, where they address some of the space constrictions?
Yeah, good question. So there's two different types of crates, should mention. So gestation crates are, I mean, they're not permitted in the UK, not permitted in many parts of the world, but they'd had them in systems in Brazil when I went to, which are these cages that a sow can stand up and lie down when she's pregnant, so not with piglets. And some of them stay in that for their whole life. And I think there is overwhelming evidence that that is incredibly bad for their welfare. And taking them out of that situation and putting them in a group situation means that they have much higher welfare, and there's essentially almost no compromise on environmental impact. Farrowing crates are a slightly more complex story. So these are, again, a kind of metal cage, typically, that is around the sow, and she's put in just before she gives birth, and then she's kept there for a few days to a few weeks. And there's different regulations, different parts of the world. And in that, she can stand up and lie down, and essentially slows down how she lies down and gives the piglets time to get away, because the leading cause of piglet mortality in systems that don't have these cages is usually being crushed by the sow. And so they were really, and they're in some cases still seen as this like really difficult compromise of what do you prioritize, the welfare of the piglets or the sow. But excitingly, there are advances now in this area. So people are designing the kind of arcs that you might see that are outdoor pigs that have special things within them that mean that the sow has to lie down, makes her lie down more slowly, that are reducing mortality. There's also in indoor systems, increasingly, that they're only in the crate for a very critical period for a few days, and then the sow is free to roam, which again, we know is better for her welfare. And there's even these kind of, what are they called? Like the arcade games with the claw. Like people are developing these things like you see in Toy Story, where like it can detect when the sow's about to lie down and goes around her to slow her. But then while she is standing up, she isn't constrained by it. So there's all kinds of exciting technologies there that seem to be avoiding this kind of trade-off between the sow's welfare and the piglet's welfare.
We have like 1 minute left. I think one question that came up in this Q&A that I do think it was one of the things I wanted to press on real quickly is like, yeah, like how, if we're thinking about these different stakeholders and we're balancing, sort of people looking at animal rights and then also animal farmers and people who want to eat, all these different stakeholders, and how can we include animals, really think about their voices when, we can't actually talk to them. But like, how do we like really take into consideration that stakeholder, I guess, or do we, in kind of policy conversations, social conversations about the future of food? Maybe each person could just do a lightning round. Nikki, I'll start with you real quick, just because we're almost out of time, but real quick.
Go to somebody else first, please. I was just reading something in the chat and wasn't fully taking notes. Sorry, Jenny.
I know it's a lot with the chat. Cleo, I'll start with you.
I mean, there are probably many ways, but one starting point, I think an interesting model might be that some countries have representatives for future generations. So basically groups who have an incredibly high stake in policies that are currently being developed, but don't have a voice currently. And you could apply that same approach to animals, just as a starting point. I think that could go a very long way.
Great. Hiba.
I think taking seriously the expertise of those who work every day with animals, have had long-term exposure with animals, and emphasizing those kinds of relationships even in the slaughterhouse, with people who, so moving towards more long-term relationships with individual animals rather than short-term, so days and months and years rather than seconds, which is usually what the interaction in the slaughterhouses.
Great. Josh.
I think Cleo hits a nail on the head with representation as a real step that we can take right now for including animals' voices here. Parliamentary representation, I think, would be crucial. I agree with Hiba. I agree with Amanda in the chat. Animals have a voice. We just need to learn to listen to them. What I would say is that we need to recognize that many people who spend a lot of time with animals have a real vested interest in certain kinds of things being in the animal's interests. And so we need to approach animals in a disinterested way. And that means recognizing that, yes, people who are profiting from the killing of animals might have a stake in this, might have knowledge here, but we can't let them control the conversation.
Provocative. Nikki.
I think that what Hiba's point about representation of those who've been working with animals, but particularly within the slaughterhouse end of the system, massively underrepresented voices, and I think that they definitely need to be more present. I really would love to spend another hour getting into the detail of how to ensure animals are represented, and I don't think it's something that we are doing at the moment at all well enough. And even like the animal health and welfare committees that exist for DEFRA, etc., just are not able to always dig into the detail of what that looks like. I do feel that the academic voice, and I speak as someone who is also an academic, I do feel the academic voice is prioritized and is given more privilege than it possibly is deserving of in some of these conversations. But I also totally accept what Josh says, that for those people whose livings and whose mortgage payments are deeply connected to the decision to slaughter animals, that there are conflicts of interests. And I think opportunities for those discussions that recognize all of those conflicts, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, is the most important thing. And frameworks for discussions around that is key.
All right, Harriet.
So we're over time.
Yes.
To go back to, I guess, an initial point that I made, I think it's got to be evidence over intuition, and we should all be challenging our own intuition and what evidence we're using to make the decisions that we're making.
I just want to thank you all, because I feel like I know I pushed all of you to try to nudge a little bit as much as I could. And I appreciate that everyone was like really open to that conversation. That was great. And great questions. And I tried to answer as many as we could. I think, you can hopefully reach out to folks on social media. I'm there way too often, so we can hopefully continue conversations that have come up. Just want to thank all of the panelists for being here, and thank the audience, and thank you, Tamsin and Jackie and everyone at table. This has been a great conversation. I think it's all from us.